And this is Writer's Voices with Monica and Caroline. I am your host, Monica Hadley, and with me is my co-host and lovely mother, Caroline Coburn.
And good afternoon, everyone. And if you're listening on Monday morning, good morning.
Right, Writer's Voices broadcasts Friday at 1 p.m., rebroadcasts Monday morning at 8 a.m., and we've been doing this now since the start of KRUU, and it's going on 9 years.
I was just wondering.
Yeah. And we have talked to hundreds of wonderful writers.
Oh, we have.
And it's really been a joy.
It has, no doubt. Yeah. And Monica probably remembers each one of them. I myself do not.
No, I don't. But sometimes I look back through the archives, and we do have archives up on writersvoices.com. I got behind on getting them up over the last couple of years. I'm just going to start catching up, trying to catch up the next couple of months so that we get them all up there. Because these interviews, a lot of them are just too powerful to have to only be heard once.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I agree there.
And some of the ones that we had up on the archives I know have been listened to thousands of times. So that's really cool. So tell us about our guest today, Mom.
Our guest today is Sukey Forbes, and she is the founder and president of an art and collectibles company and a blogger for the Huffington Post. The Angel in My Pocket is her first book. She lectures on positive grief and embracing life after loss. She has been interviewed and or featured on ABC, WGBH, NPR, LA Talk Radio, Open to Hope, Worth Magazine, Boston Magazine, and eHarmony. That's a partial list. And she and her family split their time between Boston, Massachusetts, and San Francisco. And this book is quite something.
The Angel in My Pocket, a story of love, loss, and life after death. Welcome to Writer's Voices, Sukey.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be with you today.
Well, we're very glad to have you. And let's just start with, get right out front what this book is about, why you wrote it.
Okay, well, The Angel in My Pocket is a story of my personal journey both into grief, learning how to feel it, and then out. I started out life the mother of 3 lovely children, happily married, and within the span of 3 hours, my middle child, when she was 6 years old, died unexpectedly of a high fever. And we were brought to our knees. Everything we ever thought and believed in was shattered in that moment, and individually and as a family, we had to pick ourselves up and figure out how to move forward, and in all aspects of life. And so the Angel in My Pocket is a book that I put together. It was actually a look back through the process of grief. And I found when I went through, as I determined what path I was going to take, what mindset and what long-term goal, and for me that was living and ultimately re-engaging in life, I didn't find enough resources out there that supported that. And so The Angel in My Pocket is written as a look back from a comfortable resting spot 7 years out from the actual loss, and reflecting on that and all that brought to our family and to me individually.
So that's when you started writing it, was 7 years after?
Well, the way I've always made sense of any emotional or any experience has been writing. And so for me, I spent a lot of time losing myself in my journals. I was raised in a family that didn't talk much about emotions, and so the way to understand my head and my heart was always putting a pen on a piece of paper. And early on, it became very clear to me that the choices in grief were very slim, and they were basically dying, existing, and living. And I chose to live. And again, there were not that many resources out there that really validated that process as an endpoint, and it was so discouraging that I just kept writing, and I kept track of the process, which was by no means linear, and with the idea that if and when I ever got to that place of feeling as though I was re-engaging with life and I'd actually learned from and grown from this horrible experience, that I would share it. So much of the guts of the book really were there when I sat down to write it. And then I just had to put together a bit more of a narrative flow and all of that. But much of the ingredients really came from very raw writing along the way.
Now, Sukey, you say you weren't raised in a family environment where you talked about your feelings, but you certainly did have a family heritage of writing.
Well, definitely. I'm sure probably referring to my great-great-great-grandfather, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who I felt very quickly after Charlotte died, because I am part of this New England heritage that doesn't really talk much and just sort of we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and keep marching forward. I looked to other family writings, and Emerson was obviously very prolific, and very quickly I was reminded of the fact that he had also lost a child at the age of 6 to a high fever. And I thought, bingo, oh my gosh, this is too much of a parallel. All of his writings took on new meaning to me. And I really feel as though he held my hand moving through that process. Now, my writing is nowhere near as beautiful as his on so many different levels. But he really, I feel, shepherded me through a lot of the process.
Wow. Mom, did you teach Emerson when you were a high school English teacher?
Oh, gosh, Monica, that's been...
Too long ago?
Too long ago.
Well, I always thought that Emerson was pretty oblique. He uses a lot of big words, very, very descriptive. It's hard to get your arms around the meaning of Emerson. And, one would have thought with a relative like that he would have been regular dinner table conversation. But he wasn't. But I will say that much of his general teachings in terms of self-reliance and the sense of God in nature and the divinity in each of us, that was very much the culture of how we were raised. We weren't raised with much religion, but we were raised with a great reverence for the outdoors. And in fact, the times in my life when I have needed to be closest to God, or whatever God was, I would go out and sit in a field. And I do think that comes down from the tradition of Emerson. And I will add to that that's a wonderful and powerful experience, and one that I write about in The Angel in My Pocket, and I circled back to ultimately through the course of the book. But much of the explorations in the book were about trying to find a religious belief system, because being raised a Unitarian, which is basically one God at most, doesn't create a really strong structure for what happens when we die. And so I went into a big crisis right away as to where is my daughter? What happened to this 6-year-old ball of energy and light and life? She couldn't possibly have just vaporized. And my husband, his family, they were all Catholic, and they descended with casseroles and prayer cards and were full of the belief that she had moved on to heaven. And I was so envious. My family showed up with, chainsaws and hacksaws and said, I don't know where she is. Let's go for a walk. And it was really, really difficult for me to even get past, to even sink into grief. That seemed like such a luxury to me to feel any emotion until I had a strong sense in my head and my heart as to where she was. And, of course, that's ultimately unknowable, but much of my exploration involved trying to figure out what I believed in terms of what happens when we die.
And, of course, in the book you talk about contact that you had with your daughter after her death, both directly and through mediums. And I'm guessing that might have been, was it hard for you to sort of go public with that belief?
Yes and no. First, one of the things that I think is a key to moving through a personal tragedy like this is there are two pieces. We need to sit quietly and listen to what Emerson refers to as the still small voice inside of us that knows a lot more than we actually give ourselves credit to. But we also need to be very open-minded to other ideas and ways of thinking that might bring us comfort. And for some of us, it's as simple as becoming active and moving, or joining the PTA, or picking up a new hobby, or creating a foundation for the person who's passed on. But trying on new ideas is really important. And there is nothing like desperation to open your mind. Now, it is very important to also be skeptical because we're vulnerable. But I was willing to consider anything. And particularly when somebody mentioned a psychic medium who might have the ability to talk to my daughter in whatever form she took, I mean, I was willing to consider anything. And so it was very easy for me to walk into this experience with an open mind, but also being guarded. And I personally got such confirmation beyond any ability to doubt that some essence of my daughter, some essence of who we are, remains after we die, both separate and yet somehow with us, that it gave me the comfort I needed. And I was a little bit concerned about sharing that on the page and then putting it out to the world. I thought some people are going to think I'm completely cuckoo. Well, in fact, they might, and that's completely their right. However, that was my personal experience, and I stand by it. And I will say that of all of the bits of sharing this story on the page and going out and talking to groups and sharing it both face to face as well as over the television and radio, I have been blown away by how many people, every single time I go out to talk about it, will approach me and say, I've had this experience. You know, my mother talks to me, my brother, boyfriend, sister. It's one of those experiences that people have been reluctant to acknowledge, and yet it's incredibly widespread. And I'm not trying to normalize it at all, and it doesn't necessarily need to be everyone's experience, but it was very powerfully mine, and I own it, and I welcome anyone to challenge me on it. It won't diminish it at all. But for me, the most important bit was it gave me a sense of comfort that allowed me to then re-engage with life and be a better mother to my 2 surviving children, a better wife to my husband, and to just continue to grow from this horrible, horrible experience.
I have experienced things, and I tell people if you want to experience it, you have to be open to it. That's
right.
The key.
I mean, it's. I've prepared a few passages from the Angel in My Pocket to read today, and one of them actually addresses that. I think that we have to, at a certain point, suspend our disbelief, because in this day and age, we cannot yet fully factually verify some of this. That doesn't mean it's not true. It just means we can't get there, and we have to at some point just take a leap of faith. Mm-hmm. And that's scary, but we need to do it. And there's the whole difference between believing and knowing, and it's that leap of faith.
Well, Sukey, why don't you go ahead and read that passage for us, since we're talking about that now. This is Sukey Forbes reading from The Angel in My Pocket, a story of love, loss, and life after death.
I'm going to start midway through, and it's probably about 3.5 minutes long that I'll read. I had to have answers in order to absorb the magnitude of the loss of my daughter. Where was my daughter? Who was holding her? Who was tending to her needs? I found too many people willing to gloss over those questions and fast-track to the more ethereal answers. She's with God. She's in a better place. BS. Next to her mother was the best place. Who was the cosmic and almighty parent who was now entrusted with her care? I was consumed by those questions. A protective skepticism rose up from the more customary part of my New England heritage and forced me to wrestle with my doubts as I moved forward. I was ineluctably drawn to these non-mainstream ideas, and at the same time forced myself to test them against all the input from my previous education and life experience. If a belief system is old enough to have become established, the culture shows it a certain respect, even when its claims, measured by scientific standards, are ridiculous. The virgin birth, the resurrection, God speaking to Moses, or Muhammad, or Joseph Smith. None of these things makes rational sense, and yet millions of otherwise rational people confirm their belief in them every day. Using the term literally, no one can know that Jesus is their personal Savior, or that God waits in heaven to judge the just and the wicked, because knowing requires factual evidence. And yet people say they know these things. To get to this point of uncertainty, they've made what Loyola called the sacrifice of reason, and Kierkegaard called the leap of faith. Much of belief relies on faith, and much of faith requires that blind leap. And trust. Faith is a requirement of life. Those who have not been tested perhaps do not know this. But most of the world does know that on some level faith is not elective. We often find faith in our darkest moments, when we've exhausted all other hope and have reached the end of the facts. That does not make the leap of faith or the knowing any less true. It just makes it more accessible to us when we most need it. And perhaps this is what it takes. I became willing to take the leap of faith. In so doing, I found what to believe. One can factually verify only so much, and then very quickly one needs to accept an idea on faith, completely reject it, or dive in more deeply with questions. In my experience, many people, myself included, move open-mindedly partway down that path, and then we get stuck on the questions. Really stuck. So we bail out. I'm not sure what the recipe is to move beyond that. For me, it has required part blind faith, part intuition, more than a dash of curiosity, open-mindedness, healthy skepticism, and trust. In the years after Charlotte's death, I was presented with enough fact and personal experience to allow my intuitive beliefs and experience of life after death to settle into a form of knowing. That has been enough for me to rest comfortably with her whereabouts, for lack of a better word. I had to know that she wasn't totally gone, and that if she was gone, I had to find some level of comfort with what her new address was. Even if I couldn't physically visit her, I craved that level of knowing. I didn't want to be absurd. I didn't want to sacrifice my capacity to reason, and yet I desperately needed to find the willing suspension of disbelief that Coleridge talked about in literature. I wanted to move from belief to my own form of knowing. It has been my experience that when we allow our minds to grow really quiet, we find that most of the answers we seek are inside of us, and they come from that deep space of knowing. It doesn't matter how we get to the stillness. It can be through prayer, or meditation, or repetitive and fluid activities such as walking, gardening, yoga, or running. But it's the silence that allows us to hear what the Bible calls that still small voice. Depending on your belief system, that voice could be God, angels, a spirit guide, the oversoul, or your personal intuition. But when you hear it, you know.
Thank you, Sukey. That was Sukey Forbes reading from The Angel in My Pocket, a story of love, loss, and life after death. And you're listening to Writers' Voices. One of the things I really liked about the book is that even though it is very much about Charlotte's death and how you coped with it, it actually, there's a lot more to it than that, too.
Well, I'll tell you, the paperback has just come out, and I was so pleased that they chose to put on the cover the quote, one of the quotes from a Chicago Tribune review, where they refer to it as powerful, uplifting, and fearless. And I did write this book because I felt that there were some wonderful books out there that describe the state of grief in exquisite, poignant detail. This, however, is not just about grief. This book, for me, is about living. It's about choices, and it's about what we do when we are brought to our knees by any personal crisis. And mine was losing a child. But there are many other ways that we are brought to our knees. And so it's been wonderful for me to have this book have a more broad audience in other people who have been struggling with anything from a bad diagnosis to, not knowing what to do moving forward after losing a job. I mean, there's many other ways that we're brought to our knees and we're finding ourselves at a crossroads. And this book is really about picking ourselves up and what are we going to do with what happened and how are we going to move through life? What are we going to do for the next period of time, and what are we going to make our long-term goal? And one thing I have learned in it's been 11 years now, almost to the day, since Charlotte died. But we're resilient as human beings. Death is part of the human experience. And tragedy is something that befalls all of us. We are programmed to one day be okay. And I don't, by any measure, mean to promote or say that we should never feel our pain. In fact, a large part of the process for me was learning how to feel, but moving through that, and then ultimately acknowledging that misery is optional and that we can give ourselves one day permission to be okay is a very important part of the process. And I found that lacking in a lot of the resources I looked for. And so I hope that in The Angel in My Pocket that there is some sense of hopefulness, that we can in fact be better versions of who we are before our personal tragedy, even if we would give it all back in a nanosecond. Since we can't turn back the hands of time, why not learn and grow and become better people and parents as a result of it?
Well, that's very well said. But even beyond that, even if as a reader who's not dealing with any personal tragedy right now, I still found the book incredibly interesting.
Well, thank you. It has been, again, it's been very gratifying to hear people say that. There's something, there's a lot of background that I think many people can identify with of what it, the childhood and the family dynamic. And so I do think that there's much that is relatable about that.
Oh, absolutely. And you actually have, this family island. How do you pronounce it? Noshan?
Sean. I'm actually there right now. We just have a crazy treasure hunt of kids on kayaks and paddle boards going in and out of under docks. And, it's a very, it could be a national park. It could be lots of different places. But for me, there's this wonderful gathering spot where multiple generations come every year. And we have all sorts of silly traditions, singing songs and dancing in the kitchen and playing games on horseback. And that's been a wonderful source for all of us to have these multi-generational relationships. It was also very important for me in coming to grips with loss. But, there's a lot of that silliness that it comes through in the book, and I think is very relatable to anybody who reflects upon both the good and the bad of their childhood, because, we all have crazy relatives. In fact, often if we think we don't have crazy relatives, it means we are the crazy relatives.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, the island is almost another character in the book, and another real presence in the book, yes. and seemingly in your life too. That it's and I don't think too many of us grew up with that kind of extended family structure that you had. Do you want to talk about that a little bit and how that helped you, and also ways that it held you back?
Well, I would say we spoke a little bit about this earlier. I think that when you come from a family where we all keep very close contact and very close track of each other for 8 generations now, that is a wonderful gift to have that fluid knowledge of so many different generations. I mean, when my daughter Charlotte died, I knew that family members for generations coming would remember her because there's a family tree that everybody has access to. And I know my family members who've died, 4 generations ago. I know what they look like because there are photographs. They're remembered. And I think at our core, we all want to be remembered in some way. And as a mother, I didn't want her to be forgotten. So that was very powerful, knowing that she would always be a part of this wonderful tartan of a family, of this sort of Scottish clan. That really meant a lot. But there's also a lot of, I would say, negative that comes with, all of the hundreds of unwritten rules that you just grow up knowing. And again, being part of this old New England tradition, there was not a lot of communicating and talking about emotions. And I think it was probably, in hindsight, it was more personally imposed, but I felt a really strong directive to not crumble and to be strong and stoic. And that doesn't serve anybody. And the only way out of deep personal pain is by feeling it. And boy, did I run hard from it for a while and went completely numb. And so I do think that that tradition of looking around and seeing all of these stoic Yankees just sort of soldiering on, that gave me a real a crutch and an ability to avoid descending into the pain for a time period. And so that was the negative. But overwhelmingly, I would say that it's an incredible gift to be a part of a family that has such a reverence for the land and for each other and for tradition. That was a real gift, and I will say for sure that it was a big part of my healing and part of my feeling, and particularly being in this space, in this sacred land that so many other relatives, Emerson included, had walked on these same paths and had processed things in perhaps similar ways. That to me felt very familiar and very comforting.
I was also fascinated by the access you had to these guest books from...
Oh, they're amazing. They go back 150 years. And, some of them are just logs about how many sheep and cows and whatever came on and off the island. But everybody wrote in them. And 150 years ago, everything was done by hand and in this beautiful penmanship and calligraphy. And they're just treasures, and people had painted pictures in them. And now they're all, we've got photocopies of them, but they're all being archived at the Historical Society. But, very early on, I lost myself in the pages of those books, particularly the Civil War. I did a lot of reading during that time period. My great-great-grandfather had been captured by Mosby's Rangers and was a prisoner of war during the Civil War. And reading correspondence between family members at that time period was, again, very helpful to know and get a sense for how people were dealing with their own anguish. And it still, to this day, is a wonderful rainy day activity to sort of lose myself in the pages of those books.
We have a trove of Civil War letters written from a soldier to a family member that we've started going through recently. And, it is amazing the way they wrote.
Oh, their language. They had such a better facility with language than we do. It's so embarrassing.
Yeah, and
these beautiful long it's so romantic and transporting to just sort of lose yourself in them. And in fact, again, I said that, putting together The Angel in My Pocket, in fact, long before I even wrote it, when I would sit down and just write in journals and try to find places of comfort, I did lose myself in family writings and family letters, and I stumbled upon some crazy stuff. I stumbled upon this file of letters, and one of them was a letter from my great-great-great-grandmother to her daughter detailing her son's that night at the theater where Lincoln was shot. There at Ford's Theater that night. And here's this
gosh.
account of Lee Harvey Oswald, shooting Lincoln, and it was just filed away in another. The letter is out, and people knew about it, but it wasn't really discussed. And I'm reading it, and I'm thinking, you've got to be kidding me! This is crazy. I came right upstairs and read it to my children. But those are the sort of gems. If we all dig enough, we all have gems in our family history. And yes, I come from an older family that does have maybe better records, and so that does set us at a slight advantage. But we all have extraordinary stories. We're keepers of them, either in the oral tradition or they're written down. But again, we all have these wonderful stories that make us richer people if we pay attention to them.
I've got to say this. Aren't you glad that you can read cursive?
You know what? This is so sad. I have a 14. My youngest is 14 now, and my oldest is 18, and they're printers.
I know.
I just think that's so sad that they're no longer teaching cursive in the curriculum. It's such an art.
And they won't. These kids, if you don't learn to read cursive, you won't be able to read those letters.
You know what? I hadn't even thought about that. They can't read my chicken scratch or anything. But
nobody can read mine.
Well, I used to pride myself on having good penmanship. I'm not that old, but we used to get graded on our handwriting.
Oh yes,
absolutely.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Anyway. I'm really saddened that has gone by the wayside because of the history. Everything was written in cursive.
It'll be interesting. Actually, this gets into a whole nother area. But I really think that there is a physiological connection between using, I'm a longhand writer, and I know that different people write in different ways. I also cheat and I dictate, and I use the keyboard, which I don't consider cheating. But so much of the most emotional writing is done for me longhand in a journal. And I do think there's a powerful connection of the fine motor skill that's involved in that somehow must trigger something emotional or some endorphin or something physiologically inside of us. And I think that is lost when these kids are on keyboards and they're just printing. I worry about that. I worry about what that does to creativity and the ability to paint when I think we're losing our fine motor skills.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's it's just like, of course, my grandfather saved everything, and that's why we still have these letters. And my mother saved everything, and I save things, and I'm chastised for that. But
well, not those things. You're not chastised for saving those things. My mother has never met a piece of sheet music that she doesn't love.
That's true.
Well, we all have one man's trash is another man's treasure. I've been selling antiques for years, so there's a buyer for everything, I'll tell you. But it is wonderful to have these pieces, these remnants of other people's lives that they hold energy. I think they really hold energy, and they're just this wonderful time capsule. And that's one of the beauties I find that in, I've always grown up in older houses that were conveyed down through the family, and there are these treasures everywhere. I mean, the kind of things that we come across on a daily basis. Some of them are very funny, but they're just this wonderful part of history. And it's unfortunate if we just live in a completely stale environment that doesn't hold on to these treasures.
It's very true.
Very true. One of you mentioned that there were things that your family didn't talk about, and one of them was the ghosts in the house.
Yeah, I think that as a child, it's a bit of a study in contrast because I grew up with I would say, very open-minded, bohemian and artistic family, but also very skeptical and maybe even scientific method-based. So it was an interesting contrast. And yet, growing up in these houses that had been built by and occupied by family for over 100 years, most of them have a ghost or two. And most of the ghosts are known to us. And yet, if you asked individual family members if they believed in ghosts, they'd probably say no and laugh at you. And yet, it's a fairly regular topic of conversation. The lights flicker and someone will say, oh, that's Uncle Don, or that's, Grandma Sarah. And there are, most people have had some sort of paranormal experience. But again, if you ask them directly, they'll say, oh, no, I don't believe. So it's sort of this curious dynamic. And I had as a very young child, and I write about this in The Angel in My Pocket, I saw what seemed to me like some sort of an apparition walking through a field at a very young age. And I never shared it with anybody. But it stayed with me forever. And it didn't haunt me per se, but I just kept thinking, how do I file this away in life? And how do I make sense of something like this?
I had a couple experiences, but one was pretty recent when, believe it or not, my company moved into an office building that used to be a doctor's office, a physician's office, and I had an encounter.
Did you?
There. Yeah, I did. There were other people around.
Here's the thing that you learn when you write a book like this is, and again, there's a difference for me between ghosts and between where I believe my daughter Charlotte is. But I do believe there are different dimensions, for lack of a better term, although I think that's actually a very good one. But when I've gone out to talk about this, everybody has a story.
Yeah.
They all do, and some of them laugh, and some of them are dead serious. A few will say, this happened to me, and I don't believe it. I still think it's crazy. I don't believe it. But people don't know what to do with it. And I can't explain it for you. All I can say is, based on my experience, I hear you, and I hear it every single day from people, and it's wonderful. And I think the more open-minded we become, the more opportunities we have for knowing more. And I also love where we're going scientifically, because I think science and philosophy is circling back together, and all of this quantum theory and other dimensions is really interesting. And now the scientific community is becoming more on board with some of this. I mean, the line between the line between all of this is getting really blurred again, and I find that fascinating and exciting.
Did you ever hear of pennies from heaven? You hear that concept?
No.
Okay.
I mean, yes, but I don't know about it. What is it?
Well, you find a penny on the ground, and you pick it up, and I did the other day, and the date of the penny was the date that the year that my husband died, and Monica's father, and that was from him.
Well, as you know from The Angel in My Pocket, I'm all about signs. They come to our family on a regular basis. Hawks and the angel that I carried in my pocket that I found. I do think that is a way that people who have crossed over to the other side communicate with us by, again, leaving a penny for you. Now we could say that's just a coincidence, but really? I don't know.
I know.
I mean, I'm right with you. I think that was a sign right there. And those are wonderful, soft touches. And if we choose to embrace them, it doesn't cost us much to do that. And it's this wonderful. It's an embrace or a soft kiss from that person who we miss. So, first of all, why question it? I think that we should be open to it enough and skeptical enough so that we're not fools. But it happens with enough regularity to enough people that it seems a fairly safe bet that some essence of who we are is still there and, in fact, is able to communicate with us. And isn't that terrific?
Yeah.
It is. It certainly is.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and our guest today is Sukey Forbes, the author of The Angel in My Pocket, a story of love, loss, and life after death. One thing I like to ask writers who have written memoir, which essentially that's what this book is how other members of your family and people you're close to reacted to the book.
Well, that is a really tricky thing in memoir, because we all have different levels of privacy. And so just because I'm telling my story, it's of course there's deep overlap with other family members. And so that is a tricky spot. I advise people when I sit on memoir panels or when I talk to them. In fact, I just gave this advice the other day and was just spit out back at me by someone else 2 days later. You really need to write as if no one's ever going to see it, and then go back and edit. And people have a very strong meter for when you're telling the truth and when you're not. And so, as a memoirist, there is a fine line between how much we can tell when we're exposing other people without really treading on their privacy and undoing them, because I think it is unkind to cause harm to anybody. But I do think that we can't be effective at our craft without just going right for the jugular up front. And here are a couple of nuggets of wisdom that I got from people I really regard who also write memoir along the way. And one was, people are stronger than you think. And so you may think that what you're writing is very incendiary, but they may not actually be upset by it. And yet you may write something else that you think is really harmless, and someone may go off their rocker about it. I had both of those experiences, and I can give you examples if you'd like.
Sure.
Examples? Okay. My husband, unfortunately, as is often the case, our marriage did not ultimately survive the loss, and after 7 years we ended up divorcing. We are still very good parents. I am most proud of how we co-parented, and I'm almost as proud of how we have divorced, but we are separate now. And as a courtesy, he got a read of the book, of The Galley, before it was printed. And he sent me back 10 pages of notes. And a lot of it was just sort of fact-checking and comments, and some of it's not worthy. But the places that he was upset surprised me. And one of them is an early scene. It's a very raw scene within a week or so of Charlotte dying. And I come outside, and he is standing in his underwear. And he picks up a granite planter. I don't know how much this thing weighed, but several hundred pounds. And he hurls it about 100 feet. It was a superhuman feat, just fueled by adrenaline and rage and just gutting anguish. And it was such a powerful and scary moment in so many ways. And I thought he was going to read it and say, "You've got to take this out." And he read it, and I'm reading through, and he says, when that moment when you described me outside, you said that I was in my underwear. And I said, "I did say you were in your underwear." And he said, "That doesn't work for me." "Well, if I said you were in your pajamas, can I leave it in?" And he said, "Yes." For some reason, we all have these different sensitivities. There was something about being in his underwear that was uncomfortable for him, and now I've just outed him on radio. Oops. But again, that tiny little tweak made all of the difference. And let's see, what's another example? Well, I don't know. There are many examples of that some people just, there are people remember things differently. And if you ask 4 children to describe their childhood, often you're going to get 4 different stories, and you'll think that they grew up in a different house.
That is
With
true.
some of that, I have a cousin, George Colt, who is a very wonderful writer. He wrote another book that's somewhat similar called The Big House, and he gave me some wonderful advice along the way about family sensitivities. And he had said, give everybody who is closest to you in the book a read, but be very careful about the feedback that you ask for. And be very specific about saying, is there anything in here that you can't live with? Because otherwise you may get pages and pages of notes. And I thought that was really important to be very clear about, is there anything you can't live with here? That made it easier. But I will say on a global level, it was very difficult for my immediate family was incredibly supportive. Even my ex-husband, after we split, they've been really, really supportive. And the extended family also have. And for them, that was probably even more of a violation of privacy. This family place where we all go, it is not talked about. And so that was a very tender subject for many people. And I didn't take that lightly. It was important to me that be a character and, again, a place of healing and feeling and learning. But it came at a cost of exposure on levels that were uncomfortable for certain people. And there are certain things I didn't talk about. There are certain things that I took out because the relationships in real life are more important than telling the story. And I do believe that The Angel in My Pocket stands very well on its own with what was shared, but it's important as a human being and as a writer to be really mindful of our audience, especially in memoir.
And Cabot and Beatrice, your other children, were they okay with all of it?
Well, that's interesting. You sort of can't win with teenagers.
Yeah, true.
So, one of them, I actually don't talk about them often, but one of them took me on at one point and said, "You wrote a memoir all about you." I thought, well, it's a memoir. And I didn't write about you because I didn't want to expose you. And I wanted you to have privacy. And they're not really written about it in great detail in the book.
Right.
But then shortly thereafter, within weeks or so, the same child came back to me and said, "I'm not in your book." So you sort of can't win with teens. So you just have to be careful. Neither of them have read it cover to cover. I don't know if they ever will. I think that they will take to it in their own time. I wrote it ultimately for them, and I wanted to believe that in maybe 20 years' time, that when they were more reflective on their own past and their family history, that they might wonder, how on earth did my parents make it through that kind of a tragedy and still manage to move through life and keep going and be such solid, great human beings, which I think that both their father and I have managed with great effort to do. And I want to believe that they will, at that point, want to have a story or a record and a point of view. I hope I'll still be here to talk about it with them. But that tells about that time period that was so painful for our family. And I'm sure that, there were so many bad meals and really anguish-filled days. And I bet there are a lot of question marks that are maybe too painful for them to ask now, but they'll want to know later. And much of that may be addressed for them in the book.
You're listening to Writers' Voices, and our guest today is Sukey Forbes, the author of The Angel in My Pocket, a story of love, loss, and life after death. Sukey, I know you have a couple other sections you wanted to read, and I just wanted to make a couple comments first, and then we're going to run out of time if we don't have you read. So there were a couple things. First of all, I wanted to say that where you write about Charlotte's death was incredibly powerful. It was probably the most authentic description of something like that I've ever read. I was sobbing.
Thank you. There are a number of people who have approached me and said, I can't read the book. And my first advice to them is, it's not what you think. It's a story about living. It's not really a story about death. And if you avoid that chapter, and I tell them which chapter, it's called Summer Ends, if you avoid that chapter, you can avoid some of the anguish. Now, you've read the book, and you know that it is very raw writing, and I'm proud of that, and I think that it's important in storytelling to just write completely from the heart and get that out on the page. I will say, we talked earlier, for me, using a pen is a way of being very, getting the honest emotion out. And sometimes my pen doesn't move quickly enough. I sat down and wrote most of what is in that chapter in one sitting. And I edited it probably twice now, and I handed it off, and I proofed it once in the final copy, and I can't look at it. It's so raw.
Yeah.
It's so powerfully is my experience, and that came through on the page, and I really didn't want it more edited because it is so raw. It's so raw that it's even hard for me to read, even though it's been such a part.
I don't know how you were able to write that. And then there were
there were a lot of tears as I was writing it, and there's a lot of putting together a book that's very hard, and I had a lot of help on all fronts, but certain pieces of it, and really it's the most emotional pieces of it, came pouring out mostly in one sitting, and it's the other pieces of the narrative flow and all of that. I am not good at that, and I had a lot of help in those regards, but the pieces that were just the really emotional bits, that was actually the easiest in terms of getting the words out on the page.
Well, it's interesting because for quite a bit of the earlier part of the book, you're sort of beating yourself up over being afraid people were going to judge you for not being emotional enough. And
I'm not. Well, I am now, but that's very. My husband had the more stereotypical grief-stricken reaction, and I was a zombie. And I think I was probably pretty frightening. I'm guessing that nobody judged me more than me.
I'm guessing too.
One would expect to see somebody grief-stricken walking around and sobbing in the supermarket. One doesn't expect to see a mother on the sidelines of the soccer game cheering for her child or being highly functional. I wasn't that way 24/7, but I was there enough that I thought there's something really, really wrong with me. And, that's a more complicated conversation about how we move through grief and when we do. It's not a 24/7 process. I also think as human beings, and as mothers especially, we're very good at beating ourselves up. And, I talk about that still small voice. which, by the way, is really different from that still small voice that tells us that we look fat in Spanx and that we're bad mothers and all of that. That voice does us a terrible disservice, and I don't know how to get rid of her, but if you figure it out, let me know. Because that voice really makes it hard for us to move forward. And I did beat myself up a lot, and I was very worried in putting together this book that I was going to be such an unsympathetic character that people wouldn't have sympathy with the story. But ultimately, it's about transformation and the ability to find a way to feel. And in fact, I was feeling all that time. I just didn't realize it, and I was too busy being really hard on myself. But we all move through things at our own pace and in our own way, and it looks different for each of us.
Well, you had to help your children get through this.
Well,
too.
yes, and you know that most people, virtually everyone that I interact with, when they learn that I've lost a child, particularly now because it's 11 years out and we are as a family in a very different place, I don't lead with that. And I tend to be re-engaged in life and fairly exuberant. And so that is a real conversation leveler. But even from the start, when you tell someone you've lost a child, the very first words out of their mouth will be, "I'd die if that happened to me." And you know what? I wanted to die, but I didn't get to, and that's actually the next section. What a wonderful intro!
All right.
But we don't get to, and so then what do you do? And you know what? We are resilient. We all have that option, and very few of us choose to die, and sort of life. And then we proceed from there. Maybe I should read you the section, and then we can continue the conversation.
Let's do that.
Okay. So this next section is much earlier on in The Angel in My Pocket. Everybody, again, finds their own way to move through and to process. And for me, walking, very much in the Emersonian tradition and in the family tradition, being in nature was very helpful to me. So this is a long walk that I took in early on when I was trying to figure out what in the world to do. I walked through the woods and out toward the South Shore. I walked past the owl's nest high up in the tree in the woods. I came up the hill to the main road, then crossed onto Eagle Hollow Path, and I walked back along the North Shore. I knew very little about the beliefs of the Native Americans, but I did know that their religion, like mine, encompassed both the natural and the supernatural worlds, and that it was very much grounded in a sense of place, this place. I had done so much living here. I had always felt so alive here. Now I felt utterly numb, bereft, and diminished. What was I going to do? The choices seemed basic and slim. Die, exist, live. I wanted to die, but with 2 young children to care for and a husband, that wasn't an option. Exist. I could do that. I was doing that now. But how flat and lifeless. How dreary and endless the long march would be until I met Charlotte again. The only option that resonated with me was to live. But how? How to get there from here? To feel the fullness of life again seemed a Sisyphean task, and yet I knew that somehow I had to get there. I would do whatever it took, and when I got there, I would reflect on it and hopefully help others behind me on the path. I wanted to want to live. That was the best I could do in that moment. I decided step 1 would be to fake it until I could make it. Every now and then I found myself kicking the ground just to remind myself that I was alive. I was also literally connecting with the earth, perhaps on Charlotte's behalf as well. She was no longer physically present, so I would engage the natural world for both of us. I noticed as the footing changed from grass to leaves, to sand to stone, to well-worn dirt roads with grass in the center. I focused on the change in the sound as I kicked the different surfaces. The first bridge is over the lagoon. It offers a very different experience depending on whether the 4-foot tide is high or low, coming or going. Just 2 weeks earlier, Charlotte and I had been swimming here, jumping off the bridge to ride the tide surging beneath it as it rushed out to sea. How can this be, I wondered? How can the world change so suddenly, so absolutely, so irrevocably? Emerson had walked these same paths, and he had mused over similar mysteries, and like me, he had not found it easy to emote. "I chiefly grieve that I cannot grieve," he wrote after the death of his son. "I comprehend nothing of this fact, but its bitterness. Explanations I have none, consolation none, that rises out of the fact itself. Only diversion, only oblivion of this and pursuit of new objects." Yes, I thought, but help me, fix me. You who were here before, help me. So in that passage, it was a very powerful turning point for me, where I realized that my best option was to want to live. And that for me identified the entire process of my grief, and still does to this day. And it wasn't linear, and there were very messy pieces. But I knew that someday that was my goal, and I was going to try to get to that place. And if I did, I would share the story. And again, this book, The Angel in My Pocket, I wrote because I needed it on my nightstand. After making that decision to live and to re-embrace life, I didn't find enough out there that really showed somebody fully back and re-engaged and loving life and learning and a better parent and human being on all fronts. I found it seemed as though there were some people who got there partway. Maybe they shared the story early. I'm not sure what it was. But there was nothing out there that gave me the hope that life could one day be as good or better.
Wow. Sukey, we only have a few seconds left. Are you going to write another book?
I am currently working on a book about what it's like to turn 50 and that sort of new paradigm of it. And again, I'm wrestling with a lot of the whole memoir stuff. How much do I want to share of my own?
Oh,
Crazy.
Yeah, turning 50, that's a big one.
Yeah, that is a big one. But there's also, I don't know if I'm ultimately going to publish it. Again, taking my own advice, I'm writing, and who knows if I'll ultimately share it. It's pretty scary, but it's exciting. And I'm also doing some other projects in and around what walking that line so close to death teaches us about living in the here and now.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. And if you want to connect with me further, I'm very active on social media and have a website, SukeyForbes.com.
Perfect. And, Mom, do you have some closing words for us today?
Well, I do, and actually this is from the book, so they're really Sukey's words. If you come to believe that death is not the end, you will release a limited potential in yourself. You will also have conquered your greatest fear.
Thank you for joining us on Writers' Voices, and see you next week. Stay tuned now for Planet Erstwhile with James Moore.